Okay, so we're going to begin with monotheism and talk about some of the arguments for and against the existence of God. One of the most famous ones for the existence of God is the design argument. This is a fairly simple argument. It's an analogical argument, so it's comparing, you could call it a comparative sort of argument. So basically, it says that the natural world has functions, perhaps, or whatever you want to call them, traits, characteristics that mirror the things that humans create. So humans make things that do stuff they want to do. So if you want to tell time, they design a watch to do that. And human created objects have these traits because of being designed. So we design them to do stuff, and that's why they have those traits, right? So then things that are like must have similar causes, and therefore, since the natural world shares the trait of having functions, or whatever you want to call these properties, with the human designed objects, and human designed objects have those traits because of being designed, then the natural world also has a designer, and then the conclusion is that that designer must be God, therefore God exists. So talking about functions then, the basic idea is that a watch has functions, and stuff in the natural world like alligators also have functions. So watch functions keep time. It might not be so obvious what the function of natural stuff is, but that's one of the problems with this argument. But anyway, so the functions of the watch, all the parts of the watch contribute to this function, and the parts come together in a designed whole. So if a part is missing, like the battery fails, then the watch can't fulfill its function anymore. This is supposed to mirror the way that alligators, or any other example that you want to take in the natural world, has a function as well. Usually you could think of this perhaps as like it's a cog in the ecosystem. So the alligator perhaps keeps the population of whatever things it eats down, right? And maybe it eats certain things and excretes other things, and it fits into this biological, ecological niche. So one could argue that the complexity of the alligator certainly exceeds the complexity of something like a watch. So William Paley, for example, argues that if the watch has a designer, then an alligator, not to mention the rest of the universe, must also have a designer, since, again, it has a function, it fulfills that function. Now you might think, well, really these things are not that similar, and you wouldn't be the first one to think that. David Hume says, look, really, stuff designed by humans isn't like the natural stuff at all. He says if we see two houses, we might assume they're built by the same person, they're built by humans, perhaps, whatever you would assume when you see two human-made things that are similar. But to argue similar causes for an alligator and a watch seems like a stretch, right? I mean, just because they have some kind of function is perhaps not enough to say that they're both designed in the same way. And the structure of the two objects is a lot different. You have human-made stuff that's made out of, say, wood, plastic, whatever we make stuff out of, and the natural stuff is made out of living cells. It's made out of rock. It's made out of different kind of stuff for the most part, or at least stuff arranged in a different way. And Paley's argument that things in the natural world share the property of designedness seems to many people have been refuted by the theory of evolution. Look, stuff like alligators are the way they are because they evolved to be that way, because that's how they survive and how they perpetuate the species and how they fit into their ecological niche. So scientists have found convincing evidence that living beings adapt to their environment over time. So their ability to achieve their functions is probably natural selection. We don't necessarily need to posit a divine creator to explain that. Hume also points out that the move from premise 4 to conclusion 5, that because we need a designer for these things, that designer must be God, is a big leap. He says an imperfect being could have designed the world. Even more than one being could have designed the world. There's no reason to think that it would have to be something like a God. So nothing in the design argument proves that God, especially the kind of God that we outlined at the beginning of this chapter, actually created the universe. Hume continues with another objection that's kind of related, and he says, well, okay, let's assume for a second that the universe does need a designer, that there has to be a designer of the universe. Why not think that the designer also needs a designer, because the designer also has a function, which is to create the universe, perhaps other things as well. But if the designer needs a designer, then it seems like we have an infinite recurrence of causes and an infinite number of gods, and that's not what monotheists want.